what it means for the nonprofit sector, and then what to actually do based on those changes as well. Some of you who've been here before know this, but we have put a bunch of work, particularly my colleague Simone, into making this approved for CFRE credit. We pay some money, we do a bunch of legwork in advance to make sure this all happens. And then we know that a lot of folks have had their professional development budgets zeroed out. So this counts as credit. If you're not CFRE approved or you haven't done this, you can go check it out. They're a nonprofit, they certify fundraising professionals. It takes about 15 credits every 3 years to renew it, a couple more, and I think a quick test to get it the first time. So it's a professional development thing. If you're interested, you can obviously learn a lot whether or not you're CFRE approved. So do that. Also, it is the case that CFRE will audit your credits. So we put a survey at the end of this, and you just have to note that you were here, and then we sign off of it if you ever get audited. Other quick thing is that recordings will be sent around after the fact. Usually it takes us a couple hours to process it, get it out to you, but someone asked if they had colleagues they could share this with after, and so we'll send both the slides, so you don't have to furiously take notes, and the recording as well. Agenda for today: intros, how your week is going, what are some insights around older donors having right now, what are some strategies for success. We'll talk a little bit about QCDs, which are the fastest growing type of gift among this group, and then we'll do next steps and questions and answers. Introductions. So I know many of you have been delighted to meet some of you in person, although not mostly in the last 12 months. I'm Patrick, alongside my co-founder Jenny. We are lucky to be the co-founders of FreeWill. We're working alongside an amazing team of 82 people. Originally we were based in New York, and now folks are joining from around the country. So we're almost at $2.5 billion raised in terms of plan gifts and stock gifts and QCDs and some other things. So that's really exciting for us, and we will hopefully sort of cross that threshold before we chat again in a few weeks. So really exciting. If, by the way, you talk to anyone on the FreeWill team this week, and I know a lot of folks on the call are partners, just give them a shout out. I think, you basically have a lot of people working really hard, and a lot of these folks are sort of younger, maybe single, and it tends to be a relatively isolating period, having gone through this big pandemic, or even worse, they're back living with their parents and they're really, really anxious to get out of that. So a lot of folks have worked really hard. So make a quick note there if you can. And also if that applies to you, where it's just been a really long 12-ish months and you're really excited about a lot less isolation, good on you for getting through this as well. Okay, before we dive into this, one folks in the community, as we think about older donors, it's really important to get into the mindset of them and the things that shape them. So we are going to give away a couple books that were the dominant books of the 60s when a lot of these donors came of age. So we'll send copies of various books to 20 people, and that includes To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which is obviously one of the canonical books of sort of American literature. Slaughterhouse-Five, which ended up being one of the most popular books of the decade. This is by Kurt Vonnegut. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, one of the great American poets of the last 100 years, and The Autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, who also, as many of you know, wrote Roots, and Roots, the book, but then also the miniseries became one of the sort of dominant learnings and shared experiences of this generation. So really cool. Wish we could send it to more people. Unfortunately, all these things cost money. But again, just sort of make a note in the survey, throw us your address, and we'll be able to send this to a bunch of folks. So pretty fun. Highly recommend all of these if you haven't read them at all. So there it is. We asked people how their week is going, and as many of you know, we've been tracking this since the beginning of the pandemic, and you can check this out. The blue line, which is happiness, is really begin to plateau as the highest thing. Anxiety is staying really low. Loneliness is getting a little bit lower, which is really good news. Hopefully people are getting outside and being sort of responsibly communal. So this is exciting. But also we asked people how things are going and what you're worried about. And this blue line is not as good. This blue line is going up, and it's hitting goals. So 60% of folks who are joining today are worried about hitting their goals this year. Other people are worried about health and safety of donors. Very few people are worried about losing their jobs. And as we talked about this last week, but that dark green line, almost hunter green, not the sort of teal green at the bottom, you can see April 24th, that hits about 30%. 30% of folks are worried about losing their jobs, and people can sense, I think, the economy turning around. So that's really, really positive as well. By the way, I see some folks entering their address in the chat. Don't do that. We can't necessarily track all of that. There'll be a survey at the end, and we'll make sure to read that there. All right, so let's talk about understanding 65 plus donors. And when we're talking about older donors, we're mostly going to talk about 65 plus. That is not terrifically old, but it's a nice breaking point. And we'll talk about a couple generations. And before we get into this, I just want to make a note around how you might want to think about older donors and older Americans or older Canadians or older humans going forward. It's very tempting to think about old people as a category. And you might see things like old people tend to have bad knees compared to younger people, and that's true. People born in a certain year or a certain decade as having similar characteristics, instead of simply that old folks are like this. And just as a quick example, when I was growing up, my grandparents, my mom's parents, who have since passed away, played bridge all the time. And they were really good at bridge. Occasionally I tried to play with them. I would get walloped and I'd sort of sulk away and not play anymore. And I always thought of bridge as an old person's game, something that old people did. And when I was 70 or 80, I would be playing bridge. And it turns out that's not true. In their 20s and 30s, they played bridge all the time. And it was the main social interaction. And they had bridge clubs at 30s and 40s and in their 50s, and not necessarily just as older folks. And it's sort of a mental shift that actually, there are very popular video games now, and I don't really play video games, so I might be butchering some of this, but things like Call of Duty or Mario Kart or all these things that are actually going to travel with people as the decades go on. And that in nursing homes at 95, you'll have people playing video games and not necessarily card games, because it is not the case that old people play a certain type of game. It's more that generations tend to do that same thing. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about it. And what it does mean is it's a little bit more work on us, because every 3 or 5 years, we've got to rejigger our interpretation of what it means to be an older person. Evie says bingo. It's a good idea. Like, you are not going to suddenly play lots of bingo when you're 85. You don't play lots of bingo now. Folks who are playing bingo at 85 are playing bingo at 45. So key point there. All right, so let's talk about 65-year-old donors. We asked people how they think of describing these folks, and I mean, just really wonderful adjectives here: generous, passionate, engaged, loving, kind, committed, interested, etc. So these are folks who are, in many cases, the backbone of your organization. So before we get into fundraising behavior and everything else, let's just sort of take a deep dive into what the existence of these folks is like. So there are 2 generations of older donors. What we call the silent generation. I actually don't know the etymology of the silent generation. So if anyone wants to type that in the chat, why it's called the silent, I would be delighted to see it. Born 1928 to 1945. So these folks are 76 to 93 right now. Boomers, next generation down. So we'll include some of the folks we're talking about today. Born 1946 to 1964. Note that while silent generation is older, there are actually many fewer of them, not just because some have passed away, fewer were born in that segment, and that is being born into the Great Depression, into World War II. Really sort of a tough time to be born. Boomers born into the post-war expansion. Obviously, a bunch of stressful things happened in that 20-year period, but a very different world. By the way, traditionalist, this is from Laura, thank you so much, says it's the silent. And then also a bunch of other difficult things. So Lauren and some other folks have noted that as well in the chat. If you're curious, go read up there. So thank you, Laura and Lauren, for your help there. This population is also massive. So, and the growth rate is enormous. So the 65-year-old population grew by over a third, 35%, during the past decade. It's now 14 million. It grew by 14 million. It's now 52 million. And if you look forward to 2050, it's going to be about 92 million. So the percentage of Americans and the raw number of Americans, this is all US stats, so please excuse me for those folks listening outside the US, but you'll see similar demographics in a lot of countries, is just stunningly large. And so we're looking at increasingly large segments of the population. Now, part of this is you just have both more people being born in this demographic and then fewer people born later. So what you see here is the graph of the baby boom. This is births per 1,000 women, which is typically how demographers look at birth rates. And you can see 1945, 1946, these births shoot up. It peaks in about 1956 and then gradually trails off. So you have a massive portion, of enlisted men, mostly men, coming home from war in Europe and Asia, et cetera. Babies are roughly born 9 months later. That's how this works. And then you see this sort of huge jump and then ongoingly with younger siblings, et cetera. So that big early spurt is 75 years old right now. About 10,000 people turning 75 every day in the United States. So pretty astounding to sort of zoom out and look at how human behavior creates this sort of massive shifts. What you see afterwards is a relatively smaller number. And in part that's because the earlier generation, the silent generation, were having fewer kids. Silent generation tends to be the parents, not always, but often the parents of Gen X, which is a smaller generation as well. Boomers tend to be the parents of millennials, which later shows up as a much larger generation. So a couple interesting things here. This group is way more religious than your younger supporters. So 80% of boomers, 90% of silents identify with a religion, compared to only 35% of millennials. So this is pretty night and day here. As a quick note, by the way, for those of you that are working with religious organizations, this is going to mean lots of donations from these folks and lots of planned gifts as a way to sustain yourself as you continue to grow your base among younger generations. They tend to be less educated than younger generations. So only 25% of boomers and only 10% of the silent generation has a bachelor's degree from college. And this is pretty. Most of you on this conversation do have a bachelor's degree or some equivalent, and it's easy to forget how rare that is, even among millennials, right? Only 2 out of every 5 millennials has a bachelor's degree, and these are all folks that are old enough to have graduated. And so both remember how fortunate we are, but also as we talk to donors, it's very easy to get lost in a little filter bubble. Some other things to note, they just had more children, and many are now grandparents compared to younger generation. So 67% of boomers and 83% of silents were married by the time they were 25 and 37, compared to only 46% of millennials. So almost twice as many silent generation folks were married at the same age of millennials. Now, why is this? A couple different factors. Certainly things like easy access to birth control, also the role of women in the workplace and the idea that more and more women could sustain themselves outside of marriage. Cultural norms are shifting. Lots of other things are happening there. So you see this trend play out. It will be curious to see what this looks like for Gen Z as time goes on. 58% of boomers were moms between the ages of 20 and 35, compared to only 48% of millennials. That number is even higher for silents, by the way. So really interesting stuff. It looks like, by the way, there's occasionally some lag here. So I'll keep an eye on that. If it gets worse, we'll just switch to phone audio. This is going to be pretty easy. Thanks for noting that. So feel free to note in the chat. These generations experience huge shifts in culture and technology. So their childhoods were shaped by the Cold War and McCarthyism. We look in this, they grew up amid the civil rights movement. Okay, we'll pause for a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shift to phone audio, and that should cut out any of the freezing issues. So just hold on to a moment in a new location, and there's still some challenges on the Texas internet and electricity grid. So this might be happening. So hold on for one moment, and we'll be right back on phone audio. Great.
So give me a thumbs up or a note in the chat if you can hear, and we should be back in shape. Great. All right. Thanks so much. So appreciate everybody. This is one of the wonders of 2021 that we're all working through this together. So let's come back into this, and you can just close your eyes. If you know, some of you may be 75, and so you've lived through all this, which will still be interesting to recap. And some of you are certainly not. So let's sort of think through, what is it actually like to be someone of this age? So your childhood was shaped by Cold War and McCarthyism. You grew up during the civil rights movement, the cultural shifts of the 50s and 60s. You may have fought in, or you may have protested, or you may have protested in support for the Vietnam War. You were the first people to see innovative tech like color TV and cable and internet and the first smartphone. Let's actually break that down a little bit further. So this is the life of a 75-year-old and what might be happening. You were born in 1946. So you are the first human to basically be born after World War II. You're the earliest people to be born without a world war in your lifetime. At age 6, the Cold War is under full swing. And if you've ever seen these videos, they're so striking. So they basically have an animated turtle, and this turtle is coaching. These are sort of produced by the federal government in conjunction with Hollywood studios. There's a turtle, and this turtle is basically the mascot of this idea of duck and cover, which is what you have to do in an atomic or nuclear explosion in your hometown or anywhere nearby. So they say if you see a flash, you duck and cover, and then it's just 3 minutes of school children, other folks sort of finding an alley, a table, etc. And you're basically trained knowing that nuclear war may be an any-minute thing for years and years. It's really striking to go back and watch these videos and just sort of put yourself in the mindset of a 6-year-old. Right after the Bay of Pigs, which would have been 1962, I think, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was after the Bay of Pigs, and their Soviet missiles sort of immediately offshore, and people were literally expecting potential apocalypse in reality. At age 17, so you might be wrapping up high school, color TV becomes mainstream. John F. Kennedy is assassinated, throwing the country into a lot of tumult. The Civil Rights Act would have been passed in '64, the year after. At 23, and you can imagine what you were like as a 23-year-old. Man walks on the moon for the first time. The Vietnam draft starts, and some of the folks, mostly young men that you know, are heading off. At age 28, Nixon resigns. The oil embargo is underway. That was when OPEC countries squeezed the U.S. as a retaliation and support for Israel and some of the wars there. And so gas prices are through the roof. Recession's hitting hard. You have long lines and rationing at gas stations. You're 10 years later, the first Macintosh comes out. This is the first personal computer. And so what that means is, that computing begins to be in people's houses. And you're only 38. I mean, many of you are in your late 30s now, and you can imagine you're still learning and adopting some new tech. And this is basically one of the first big computing shifts for folks. Age 43, when the Berlin Wall falls. At age 47, I mean, the gap between the Berlin Wall and the internet feels quite big. But 1993 is when AOL, America Online, begins to gain popularity, and the internet goes mainstream. You're age 50, you're 55, so you're still working, you still have a normal job, you're watching TV. At this point, you're probably using email for 7 or 8 years. 9/11 happens. At this point, cell phones have become ubiquitous. It'll only be ubiquitous for a few years here. At age 61, so this is now almost 15 years ago. You've spent 20% of your life with a smartphone, or at least smartphones becoming quickly ubiquitous. More people would have adapted them in 2010, 2011. 69, the Supreme Court rules in favor of gay marriage and the continuation of civil rights and social change that you would have seen in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s continues. 74, you guys probably remember this part, COVID-19 pandemic creates these massive historical shifts, and suddenly you're much more isolated. And then 75, the only female president or vice president in your lifetime. And 70, you think about this from, not just your female donors, but also your male donors, how striking this would be in 2021. So that's just a little trip through history to sort of position ourselves as how we're thinking about these folks. And it's very easy to sort of talk in demographics and statistics, but rooting ourselves in empathy for the life these people have led, now allows us to talk to them much more easily. So I hope that was helpful. Let's talk about how that influenced their lives. So these folks, boomers and silents, are the most charitable generations, in part because they tend to be wealthier than subsequent generations, but they make up 41% of all donations and 55% of all high net worth donors. They prefer giving to well-known, respected organizations, so they tend to fund new projects a little bit less, and 45% of donors research an organization before making a gift. They also, people forget this, they really drift to online giving. So 64% of boomers prefer to give online, only 19% prefer to send a check in the mail. And one of the big innovations that's happened in their lives, we didn't talk about it all, is the credit card and a move to a cashless society, which is a huge shift and something that we sort of take for granted at this point. When we think about where they're prioritizing gifts here, you can see on the two right columns the key areas that folks are most interested. And these are not necessarily ranked, by the way, but local social service, worship, emergency relief, health, children, military, animal, formal education, and these end up being the key things. That asterisk, by the way, if they said, okay, what is the most important? You can see it's worship, and worship, church, synagogue, mosques for those generations. The only area, by the way, where worship is not the top one when you're force ranking folks is not for millennials and Gen Z, it's for Gen X. So that's really interesting. The biggest concentration for millennials and Gen Z is also religious, as it's sort of still the most important part of even an increasingly smaller portion. So that's really curious. You can also see how, at least millennials, they're the one generation, grew up during the Iraq War, and both Iraq wars, frankly. And so military doesn't fall into that. So things like supporting the USO or others are really sort of quite high in the other three columns, but not necessarily millennials. All right, we've asked folks how does it even matter? How many donors do you have that are over 65? It turns out a lot. Only 7% of folks said less than 25%. There's this quarter that says, I don't know. So we'll sort of forget about that for a moment. But 25 to 50%, 20%, 50 to 75%, over 65, 35%, and then 75 to 100% is 12%. So, I mean, this is, we want to talk about fundraising. We're really mostly talking about fundraising from older donors. This is percent of donor base, but we're not even getting into, the size of gifts, which are going to vary dramatically based on this. So let's take a look, and we'll go into some of the wealth stuff in a moment. So trend one is a rapid move to technology. And I think this is really an area where you want to think, what year were people born, as opposed to what is my mental image of an old person? Because some professionals and nonprofits are slow to catch up on this trend because they really have this locked in view of the grandparents that might have visited a nursing home in the 90s or the 80s, and really sort of not having a clue on technology for that generation, which is really sort of came of age a little bit too late to be a rapid adopter. Now, this generation is quite different. So at the beginning of 2020, 73% were regular internet users. This is before pandemic hit. 68% of boomers and 40% of silents owned a smartphone, which tends to be a little bit more difficult to use than a laptop computer or a desktop computer in 2019. Since the spread of COVID, obviously internet usage has shot up among all cohorts, specifically this group as well, though. So they're increasingly relying on social media to connect with friends and family and replace a lot of the other connections that they might have had in a day-to-day life. And so sophistication of technology, and particularly social media, which we'll talk about in a second, is really important here, and it's just sort of through the roof. People forget, by the way, before we get on to the next thing, that boomers are actually the most common users of Facebook, much more so than millennials or Gen Z, who are shifting to other platforms and frankly have a much more mixed view on social media. The sort of overall approval rate of social media is much higher among older donors. Part of this also, I think, some of you have seen in the news, older Americans tend to be a little bit more susceptible to fake news because they're not used to having this sort of filter on self-created media. If you grew up with Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, you sort of believe that anything that is well told and well printed, might be a little bit more true. And so the deep skepticism that Gen Z has doesn't always filter up. Okay, trend two, isolation taking a toll here. Nearly 14 million Americans over the age of 65, is almost a third of the population live by themselves. This is a remarkably high number. It's very easy to miss, by the way, how many of these folks don't have kids, because definitionally, everyone on this call was raised by people who had children, for the most part, or were raised by people who were raising children. And so you have all these folks who don't have kids, who are more isolated, but they might not necessarily be in your communication sphere. AARP and Kaiser Family Foundations suggest that 43% of all older adults in the US experience loneliness, either sometimes or frequently. This is pre-COVID. So solving loneliness and connection is a really important part of our work with older Americans and older donors generally. And this isn't just sort of a sad problem. Lack of social connection, lack of brain stimulation is associated with things like higher risk of heart disease, dementia, even premature death. And so building community, building support, building connections in your own work, separate from all the money you're raising for great causes, plays a really important role. And I'm sure that many of you see this in your day-to-day work and how valued you are for that connection. The big trend 3 here is wealth becoming even more concentrated to older generations. So you can see these trends over time. That purplish line at the top is 55 to 69. That light blue line is 70 and over. And this is the percentage of total wealth. So there may be some wealth growing overall, but you can see that 55 to 69, almost half of all wealth, that 70 and over are increasing in their wealth. Now, this is sort of unusual, right? These folks are retired, they're not earning. Why is that happening? We'll get to that in a moment. You see, in 1990, folks that we can, call millennials now, although with something else, in 1990, they used to own 12% of all wealth, and that's been drifting down. I mean, that's what student loans will do, and swelling wages. So interesting to see here. A little bit sad if you're like me and under 40. The average net worth, you can see, is barely shifting. So let's take a look at this column by column. In 1998, average net worth of someone 20 to 35 was 100,000. In 2019, it's only down a little bit. I think this was inflation adjusted, for the record. In 36 to 51, you're seeing that grow, 377,000 to 509,000. It's where home ownership really plays a role in building wealth. And then look at the gap between 52 to 70 from 1998 to 2019. I mean, all of the wealth gains in America are going to this group. If we're gonna raise a lot of money this year, we're gonna start thinking about where is the money and how do we get there. The trend 4 is, why did this even happen? Well, it's because folks that are making money like you and me off of salaries are, the salaries aren't going up as quickly as some other stuff. But people that are looking and making money off investments, they're doing really, really well. So, I mean, this is a graph of the S&P 500, which is one of the 2 or 3 major indices in American business media as a way to track how the overall stock market doing. Down a couple points today, down a little bit yesterday, but generally just off the chart. And so, this goes back to 2016. You can see that sort of dip at the bottom. It's about 2,000. This graph doesn't go down to 0. And boy, it's almost doubled since 2016. And so if your retirement assets are all in this stuff, and you were saying, I'm going to live for 20 years off these or 30 years, well, now you might be living off them over 60 or 70 years because they're twice as big as you expected. And most people don't spend down their retirement assets fast enough to be outweighing these massive gains in the stock market. So lots and lots of wealth piling up here, both at the sort of super elite levels and at upper middle class, et cetera. The other thing that's happening, especially in 2020 and early 2021, is that not only are these folks sort of pulling in all the capital gains and all the growth in their retirement accounts, also consumer spending just dropped off a cliff. And these are the folks that needed to be spending for the economy to keep going. And yet, obviously, for many understandable reasons, no restaurants, no plays, no theater, no movie tickets, no cruises, no travel, no airline trips to see grandkids. And so there's so much money that's being saved up, and that savings is growing because of all the investment returns, that there's a lot of pent-up spending potential. And so if you were a small business owner thinking about restaurants, you're just trying to hold on for everyone to get vaccinated. And then, boy, this is going to, you might see things like outdoor or both indoor and outdoor dining in a post-vaccine world be at 50% higher than normal rates for a little while, because there's so much spending that hasn't been spent. There's so much money in discretionary income that's ready to go. Also a really good avenue for fundraisers. All right, so what does this mean for the nonprofit world, and what are they doing about it? Well, one thing we're looking at is we expected to see in-person visits with older donors in 2021. Most of the folks said, look, we're not currently doing it, but we hope to before the end of the year. 25% said it's unlikely. 9% said they already are, which is more power to you, but I hope everything's being safe. And then, some folks just don't know either way. So this will return, but we're really looking at, by the time you're safely vaccinated, by the time they're all doing it, by the time travel's opened up, and your relatively risk-averse nonprofit is welcoming folks to do this stuff, we're looking at probably mid to late fall in terms of this happening again. We did do a full session, by the way, on how to effectively plan around events in 2021. So you can go check that out on the webinars page. And there's a lot of different strategies on how do you plan ahead, how do you make sure that you're not crowded out if all of the events are happening under a very small time frame, and how might you move quickly while maintaining some flexibility. We've asked folks how they've changed their strategy vis-a-vis older donors. 57% are increasing phone calls and virtual events. 46% are promoting more digital ways to give. A third are increasing their social media presence. So this is some of what other folks are doing. And then 16% are just, haven't decided to do anything differently. And when we ask about primary avenues, this is the really striking one. We'll talk about other things. 90% of folks are now using email as one of their primary ways to reach older donors. And this is exactly right. This trend, it was too slow in coming, but the tech adoption among older Americans is just through the roof. And you should be connecting with more folks over email, and mail is helpful, but it's really expensive, and it may not be the most effective route to do it. Direct mail, so 83%, that's starting to shift down. If we had done this 5 years ago and talked about this, direct mail would be at 100%. 100% of folks would have said that that's their primary avenue. 74% phone calls, 28% social media, 13% video calls. People expected that to take off during the pandemic. It didn't really. Most people are just much more comfortable on the phone. Text messages, 6%. We're not going to talk much about this later. This is one of the most underrated avenues to talk to donors. So text messaging feels deeply personal. It's on their time. It's not as intrusive as a phone call. It's much more personal than an email. It's a really, really good middle ground. And virtually all of your older donors, let's call it everyone under 80, is going to be very safely texting. And so that's a good way to continue to build a relationship. It takes you very little time. It doesn't require elaborate scheduling, but that's a big avenue there as well. In the last session we did on effective writing, there were a couple of tips on how to write effective text messages in this context. And then we look at primary gift types. Obviously, cash is a big one. Bequest, 51%. So we'll talk more about this, but planned giving is through the roof over the last 14 months. And this is going to be what funds many of your organizations for the next 3 decades, especially those that have 75% older donors, 50% older donors. This is really key. Major gifts, 45%, stock, 33%, donor advised funds, a third, and then QCDs, which we'll talk about, 28%. These are the fastest growing gifts among older donors by a very, very wide margin, and probably the area where you want to be focusing the most attention for this cohort. Charitable gift annuities, by the way, some people do that as well, 10%. There's a potential that CGAs are going to have a renaissance soon. If that happens, we'll talk much more about it. There may be some pending legislation that could shift things here. Charitable trust, 8%. If you have a sophisticated team, they might be working on these. Otherwise, wouldn't worry too much about those as well. So what do we actually do with this? All these sort of changes, all the way that donors are behaving. Let's talk through some successful strategies. One, Facebook is your best friend here. If you think about social media, so 33% of nonprofits are increasing social media outreach right now. 78% of boomers and almost 40% of silent regularly use Facebook. These numbers are probably underestimating it a little bit because the data we pull is obviously never from surveys that happened this week. And so this shift is happening pretty dramatically. American adults spend an average of 1 hour per day on Facebook in normal times. And we've seen, let's see if this shows up, the increase, this is the graph of the increased average time on social media as of March 2020. What this means is 10% are spending an additional half hour on social media. 20% are spending an additional 30 minutes to an hour 30% are spending an additional 1 to 2 hours on social media. And this is especially true for folks who are retired and really need that connection. Some folks are spending as much as 2 to 3 or 3 hours more. I mean, this is almost alarming, but also really important from a connection standpoint. But you can see how much time is there. And so things like not just pictures, but things that you can actually interact with are really key here. What does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean to do this well without spending so much time on it? Well, video messages are super useful. And these can be easy and quick. They can be a handheld camera from a museum curator, from a violinist, from a professor, from a teacher, all these things. The other thing that people forget to do is you want to quickly connect via Facebook message or reply, comment when someone likes or comments. So if someone just sits through your 3-minute video about a cool new painting in the museum, and then they say, wow, this is amazing, you can reach out to them immediately and say, great, do you want to hear more about upcoming exhibits? Would you ever want to talk about supporting something like this? And being very quick there is really key. The half-life of this stuff is very short. Also, social media users are extremely willing to take surveys. They're sort of in like click mode, either with their fingers or typing. And so this way you can see who's ready to help. You can actually see who's lonely and needs checking in on. We really are big fans of asking how people are doing in surveys on top of just normal survey questions. You want to service who is a donor advised fund, who is a stock, who is a qualified charitable distribution, et cetera. And then you want to request the phone number for immediate follow-up. And so if someone fills out the survey and you see it come through, you could call them in the next few minutes. There's a template on our resources page. We'll share that in the email afterwards, but really helpful. We've structured this all for you. I think my colleagues Magda and Simone worked on that, and they did a great job. So that's some stuff on social media. Yes, there'll be some people that are not reached that way. Most major donors, when we look at these tech trends, you can think, multiply it by another 50% for your wealthier donors, for your more educated donors. I mean, that shift is going to happen even earlier. But there are some folks who are non-digital, and those folks will be even more isolated. So the right outreach will be really productive here. We really like the idea of giving out postcards to volunteers that can be handwritten. So a lot of people are trying to volunteer right now. There's not a lot of avenues to volunteer compared to a year and a half ago. And so you can send them stamps, a list of names, a sample message, and some postcards, and them writing 15 notes will be really powerful. I also personally really like a service called mypostcard.com. There's a bunch of similar ones. Just to be super clear, we don't have any relationship or referral with these guys. We just like them, and I tend to send them to friends and family. They're $3 a piece. They're very quick. They have a photo. You basically take a photo of whatever it is. It could be your team. It could be the campus. It could be the land trust. It could be the cutest puppy you have at the animal shelter. You send it over. Why is this better than a handwritten note? Because it will stay on their fridge for the next 2 years. And it's going to feel like really connected, and it's the way that you would treat family. So it's really quick. You basically type, it sort of writes in cursive on the back. Pretty quick and easy. I'm generally a big fan. That's how I get all my thank you notes out. And so I would recommend it for major donors as well. Other things on non-digital outreach. Sometimes you have these big events, and I know some folks are thinking about how do we hold a gala online? How do we hold maybe sort of a webinar or a conversation with an expert or something else? And some people can't make it. So for major donors who can't join virtual events, it is a great excuse for a phone call is a recap. And so you can just call and say, hey, Mary, I know you weren't able to make it. I'd love to sort of give you a 10-minute download of everything we learned. Would you be curious? And most people who are tied enough to your organization to want to be a donor in the first place will be really ready for that. You can do things like share notes from the speakers, anecdotes about the event, ways to give that were highlighted at the event, especially if you can share them and say, a lot of people are really interested in hearing about new ways to give stock or new ways to give out other IRA or something like that. And that really opens up a conversation when you show that other people are interested about them. So the third big trend here is thoughtful planned giving. So this is a graph on FreeWill of bequests by number per month. So you can see January 19, May, September into 2020, little bump in January, and then whoosh, the sort of the pandemic hits in March. March and April are off the charts, a little bit of a lull. Second wave hits in June, massive. And then we're just seeing this continue on. And so This January might have been 5 times higher than January 2019. So many people are making their plans right now that many of you feel this, but there will be $68 trillion allocated by older donors in the next 25 years. And where that money is going is being decided right now. Before this, I was looking at some of the projections around February. February looks like it's going to come in a little bit lower than January, and I was racking my brain for what trend is happening. Why might that be? Some of you probably already guessed this. It turns out that February is just 10% shorter than January, and so there'll be fewer number of requests overall. And that's what I learned this morning. The thing that's happening though is that seniors are thinking about estate planning more than ever, and you want to be sensitive to this. And it's sort of the best time for plan giving, and potentially a little bit harder than usual. And so there are a couple of key strategies here. One, you want to give multiple options as a ways to give. And so rather than saying we're only talking about plan giving, here are a couple of clear pathways that people are choosing to do so. Would you want to talk about any of them? You also want to highlight the breadth of ages making plan gifts, so it doesn't feel like we're only anchoring this to the silent generation or to late boomers. Now, when I get an email, I have no idea how many other people got that email. It could be to everybody. It could be just to me. And so making it really clear that you're part of a broad audience here is actually pretty important. We have an email template on our resources page called the triple option. And this is something for the Fairness Project, which does a lot of great work on voting rights. And so there's some content above this, but we've really zeroed in on this part of the email. So the top line would have said, we hope you're doing okay. Here's a great thing that we just did. There are multiple ways to support the Fairness Project. We want to help you figure out the way that it's best for you. Give a cash gift, Amazon Smile, join the many people who've included us in their legal will. And it says, and then it sort of walks through this. And this uses the FreeWill tool, but you can obviously do anything you like there. And you don't have to use Amazon Smile. You don't even have to use cash gifts. You can say give stock or something else, give a monthly gift, all these things. But having a couple of different options puts somebody in an analysis mode and much less defensive. And so historically, sometimes giving more than one option isn't the best avenue. When it comes to plan giving, that gets flipped on its head. Because if you say only talk about plan giving, sometimes people will sort of put their hands up and walk away. The other thing we can do here, we've done a lot of testing on online ads, and we're doing more, and so if this changes, we'll let you know. But one of the things that we like to say is, even if you plan to live to 150, you still need a will. Get started today. And so this sort of almost jokingly references the idea that everyone's going to need it at some point, but it might not be earlier. Other effective messaging includes things like, supporters of our Humane Society from 18 to 88 choose to include us in their will or trust. Would you like more info on how to join? And so opening this really big aperture of the type of folks that do this, that creates a lot of avenues for folks to join. We've also, again, our team has put a lot of work into writing these emails for you and testing them and doing some other experimentation. So just check out our resources page. They're sort of free and to download and are frankly really, really effective in terms of generating new gifts. The last thing that we're going to talk about is going really big on QCDs. So some of you know these like the back of your hand. Some of these are totally new. So I'm going to give a 50-second overview so everyone's on the same page. These are gifts out of your IRA when you are over 70 and a half years old. They are by far in the country, the fastest growing type of philanthropy. Why are they growing? Two big reasons. One, tax changes. Two, remember, all these people are turning 70 every day. So they're becoming newly eligible for these things. And these people are really wealthy, right? As compared to other generations, boomers right now have the most money. For many seniors, this will be the single best way to give to you. And so we'll talk about why that is. So these are gifts out of your IRA. It's grown 3x since 2017. The CARES Act, some of you know this, in 2020, you weren't required to take any money out of your IRA as an older person, but you are required again in 2021, and you will be required in 2022 and 2023 and 2024. It's very unusual for that to be suspended. Someone asked, are QCDs the same as donor advised funds? No, and we'll talk about the difference in a second. There's more than $7 trillion in IRAs. This is the last study we found in 2016. So if you follow the sort of simple math of demographics and stock market growth, we're looking at 15, 16, $17 trillion in retirement accounts right now. Just as a reminder, the entire US economy, the GDP of the US, is $20 trillion a year. So this is just an enormous sum of money. And What's happening though is that what we see here is folks who can't, the way the tax changes, I'll sort of spare you the long story. The short story is many fewer people are itemizing deductions right now because of the way that the calculations have shifted. And so you might talk about tax-free gifts. Most of them are actually not tax-free because 90% of the country is not itemizing deductions. And so QCDs, they lower your overall income because you're not taking money out of the IRA and putting it into your income. And so it's perfectly tax efficient if you give that away before putting it away. So compared to 2019, 2020, we actually had a lot of folks where QCDs, the average size of the gift has gone up. Now this makes sense. People have more money to give away, and those IRAs are growing, day by day with more investment as the stock market grows. And since you didn't have to take money out in 2020, that's going to be even bigger in 2021. So we talked a little bit about this. The big thing about IRAs is that money is always going to be taxed. So even if you pass away and you're below the estate tax threshold, the government still makes your heirs pay ordinary income tax on that money. So really sort of a big chunky amount of tax money is getting taken out of that. What we call post-tax money that's already been taxed is way more valuable to the donor. It's way better to leave that to heirs. It's way better to conserve. And so giving out of your IRA is almost always better than giving cash. But the problem is that most donors don't actually understand this. And if you're a professional and you're still getting your head around it, you can imagine how little your 72-year-old donor knows about it. So you can, I won't sort of share all the percentages here, but you see that tiny orange sliver at the top? That's the percentage of people who said, my donors know QCDs very well. It doesn't even register. It can't even, Google on the graph can't even get a full percentage in there. So that's how few people understand QCDs really well. So why do you want to do these? A couple things. One is that if you can get people to give QCDs, they'll give them again and again, and they'll make it their new annual gift. Now, this is really good for the donor because it meets what's called the required minimum distribution. Saves the donor a ton of money on taxes. But gifts like stocks and QCDs and also donor advised funds are so much better for you because they result in much larger gifts from the same donors. It is much, much harder to double your donor base than it is to double your average gift from the same donors. And for those of you that are trying to hit your goals, this is one of the fastest paths to do it. So when we asked people, are they going to increase their QCD marketing in 2021, 67% said yes. Only 11.5% said, no change. No one said decrease. 21% said we don't have a plan yet. So hopefully this helps with your plan. When we look at organizations that do it, we look at really clear language, and this is from St. Mary's in Indiana. You can see that second line. It says most Americans don't itemize their deductions, but you can save on income taxes anyway by taking advantage of this gift. Really clear language that's marketing folks. So cool stuff by St. Mary's. Second Harvest of Silicon Valley, which also does great stuff. This is a really important point. So remember when so many of you said, more than half, maybe more than 75% of my donors are over 65, which presumes a slightly smaller percentage over 70. Well, then what that means is that this is still going to be the best way to give, and you shouldn't be sending out emails that are only asking for cash. And so what Second Harvest of Silicon Valley does, they also have a lot of older donors. It says, P.S. if you're 70 and a half or older, you can join Second Harvest of Silicon Valley supporters who make tax-free gifts from their IRAs every year. Learn how you can save money while ensuring everyone has access to a healthy meal. This stuff is really key. The big lesson here is you need to start baking this stuff into your everyday fundraising appeals and not treating it like, oh, we put a quarter-page ad in the annual magazine. That just doesn't work in this context where you have so many donors with literally the entire American economy in their retirement account who should be giving this way, and you're getting a $50 gift instead of a $5,000 QCD. So really important here. Obviously having easy access on their website, et cetera. The second thing is that donors tend to be a little bit confused because the banks have not made it super easy to give QCDs. When we did research, you guys met my co-founder Jenny very early in the session. When Jenny went to go find the right QCD forms on Schwab, it took her about an hour, and she was on hold several times. And so Jenny, by the way, was top of her class at Harvard and manages our tech team. She's brilliant. And if it's taking her an hour, it's going to take some of your older donors 3 or 4 or 5 or never. And so it's on you to really clearly communicate how to make these gifts. You also want to do things like run trainings for major gift officers on QCDs and common questions. Major gift officers are much more confused than you think. We've trained some folks at Ivy League institutions, and you'd be surprised at how many gift officers there are still getting their heads around it. And so if you have folks without 10 years experience, it's almost certainly the case that many of them are still learning about this. And so what Second Harvest does is they actually walk people through how do you do it for each custodian, and that makes this process 6 or 7 minutes compared to a couple hours, and I think dramatically shifts their giving type. The other thing, just as an extra example, so this is really key. I showed you the Second Harvest example. Many of you know the Southern Poverty Law Center does just amazing work, both in fundraising and in the world. What you can see here is this is their actual, it's not their ways to give page. If you just get an email from SPLC, it directs you here. And on their checkout page, there's a link to give QCDs, which means they're going to get larger gifts from the same people going through this that otherwise would have just put in their credit card information. Advanced tactics, this is really interesting. So QCDs and IRA management, you know, it's not purely a philanthropic thing. People have to figure out how to take this distribution every time. And so they tend to take it at the same time every year. They tend to have these habits around financial planning. So if someone made a QCD this year, you want to follow up like 6 weeks before this time next year. And that, just so you're in that conversation, and a small note can really trigger a lot of it, because there's this external trigger of having to take the distribution every year. You want to ask QCD donors if they'd like to learn more about making the organization a beneficiary, because this is really important. I mean, this money is all going to get taxed, even if they're not above the estate tax threshold. And so this could be one of your most important planned gifts. And it's one of the best planned gifts to lead to an organization while leaving other things to heirs. Most donors also don't know they can make recurring gifts through QCDs. And so if you can tell them this, and just a little checkbox on a bunch of these forms, I mean, that does your job for the next 5 years if you do that really well. Recurring gifts tend to happen out of these. And I don't mean just sort of the monthly recurring. I mean people making regular gifts, choosing to do so every year. 70% of QCD gifts in 2020 came from previous donors. And 55% of QCD gifts came from previous QCD donors. And so what you're seeing is folks are getting in the habit of doing this and doing it every year, and then you layer on more folks and continue to give. Last thing, we're running low on time, so I want to go through this very quickly and just mention it. Many older donors are unable to visit a bank to get a medallion signature. This is going to be true for very large stock gifts or only the largest QCDs. But basically what you do is you just write a very nice email and you ask for permission to waive the requirement, and people do it. So we have this as a template as well, but it turns out a little bit of kindness goes a really long way here. Okay, so that is not everything, but a lot of what you need to know on older donors. A couple of quick things. We are going to drop a link right now to fill out the survey. So if you can do that, this is where we'll sort of select the folks from the for the book send. So we'll do that as well. And then a couple other things. We are going to be putting together a report on qualified charitable distributions. A lot of that data has been collected. We'll be compiling it later this year. So if you'd like that, just make a note. And a lot of the templates we'll be able to send to you after the fact as well. And then lastly, we're doing a session on some of the planned and major giving tools that people are using. And there's actually a lot of stuff, particularly around QCDs and how to make that easier for older donors. So if you want to sign up for that, just make a note in the survey. Also, if you want someone from our team to walk you through the QCD tool or the stock tool or the planned giving tool, if that continues to be off the chart, just let us know and we'll connect you with one of these wonderful people. They're all wildly smart and really nice. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it as well. All right, that is it. We're going to take 60 seconds to give you a chance to fill out the survey in the chat. I'm going to take a look at the questions. So I'm going to take 60 seconds, figure out what the most important pressing questions are, and then we'll come back to this. So my colleague Simone just threw that link in there. It's a SurveyMonkey link. Take a look at that, and then we'll come back in 45 seconds with a few questions. we are going to go through a couple of these questions, and we're going to get everybody off the phone for their next. So, a couple things. Seth says, do you have any LinkedIn usage insight? LinkedIn tends to not be a good thing at driving donor behavior. There are a couple of reasons why. One, a lot of your folks are retired. They're not going to be on it as much. Secondly, from a advertising on LinkedIn, LinkedIn is extremely expensive to advertise on compared to any other medium, because you have B2B advertisement, meaning business to business, ends up being super expensive. So if you are a giant cybersecurity company, you're willing to pay $10 to have your ad seen by a CEO, for one impression. Whereas on Facebook, that might be 3 cents an impression or 1 cent an impression or even less. So LinkedIn tends to be not super useful. Hillary says, do you text first without asking permission, or do you establish first that texting is okay? If it's one-to-one, if you're texting 1,000 people, you need to get opt-in. It's sort of the legal requirement and also sort of the ethical thing to do. If you are in communication with someone, you have their phone number, you can just send them a text the way you would a friend of a friend or someone else, and just introduce yourself. And if they say, don't text me, they're happy to do that. But most people actually strongly prefer text to phone call, and people don't always get permission for phone calls. And so generally you're okay there as long as it's actually a one-to-one communication. Sharon asks, is there any concern about causing recipients phone charges for texting? Do most phone plans have unlimited texting? Very few people are getting charged for texting. I wouldn't worry about that. Someone will tell you if they are, extremely rare. And if it is, it's about 5 cents. So there are plenty of things to be worried about this year. I wouldn't worry about that. Marianne says, will you send 5 to 6 direct mail pieces a year? Would you suggest replacing 1 or 2 of these with marketing to donors, using Facebook or other social media? Marianne, you probably want to think about not replace, you can do both, and you may want to shift. If you're doing cost savings, you could probably do 3 or 4 emails and take away 1 or 2 of those pieces of direct mail and have them all work together. But one of the nicest things about email is how low cost it is compared to direct mail. And so you may actually end up with more value for less money, meaning less cost to you. And so that would be good. Carolyn asks, do you have examples of nonprofit websites that do this really well? We really think SPLC is excellent. Sometimes people overrate how pretty things need to be. They really need to be clear, and you really, really need to give avenues for folks to give, not just on your ways to give page, but on your main donate page, which probably gets 100 times more traffic than your ways to give page. Anna asks, by the way, what's an RMD? It stands for required minimum distribution, which is the amount of money the government says you absolutely have to take out of your IRA every year. You actually don't have RMDs until you're 72, but you can still give charitably out of your IRA starting at 70 and a half. I know it's a little confusing, but you'll get your head around it pretty quickly. All right, last question. This is from Evie. Patrick said 90% of filers do not itemize their taxes. Is this hyperbole, or is this a real thing? It's a real thing. You can look at a bunch of tax estimates. 2021, 2020, 2019, about 10%. 2017, it would have been about 30%. And the reason is the standard deduction has gone up so high that very few people sort of make their way over it. And the sort of typical deductions that would add up and get someone over a standard deduction are things like state and local taxes. And now you're capped at how much you can deduct there, and mortgage interest. And as houses get more expensive, you're also capped now on how much mortgage interest you can deduct. So let's pause there. It's 1 o'clock Eastern. It is noon in Texas, but it's 10 a.m. on the West Coast, and I know everyone has things to do. So just a huge thank you for joining us for an hour. I really hope this was useful to you. If not, here's my email. You feel free to send in complaints or suggestions to make it better. We're really looking forward to it. We have 2 sessions coming up on the 16th, so a few weeks from now. We're going to talk a little bit more about what an exploding stock market means for philanthropy, and what $5 trillion in capital gains has been created over the last 12 months. What that's going to mean for giving, what are the common pitfalls, what are the things you want to avoid, et cetera. And then the following week, we're actually doing, we have to finalize it, but a big session on diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit world, and specifically in fundraising, which frankly tends to be relatively not diverse, both from a donor and an employee perspective. And what are some sort of easy avenues you might take some first steps on there. So really looking forward to that. And just thank you again for not only hanging out, but all the great work you're doing. And look forward to seeing you very soon.